The giant ships moved through space like dark mountains. Each one was the size of a small moon, covered in weapons that could destroy entire planets. These were the ships of the Kethvar Dominion, and they had ruled the galaxy for 300 years. Commander Zethkar stood on the bridge of his command ship, looking down at the green world below. His 6 arms moved across control panels, while his black eyes watched the screens. The Kethvar looked like giant insects, with hard shells covering their bodies and minds that worked together like a hive. They were perfect at controlling others through fear. The planet below was called New Eden. It was a farming world where humans grew food for the Dominion. Zethkar felt proud when he looked at it. The humans worked hard, caused no trouble, and produced good crops. This was how all alien races should behave under Kethvar rule. "Report on the human sectors," Zethkar said to his aide. "All production targets met, Commander. The humans are working well. No signs of rebellion or trouble," the aide replied. Zethkar nodded. Humans were weak creatures. They lived short lives, had soft bodies, and showed too much emotion. When the Kethvar first found them 50 years ago, they had just learned to travel between stars. The Dominion quickly put them in their place. Humans were allowed to live, but only as workers. They could farm, mine, and do simple jobs. Their children went to Dominion schools where they learned to obey. They could not have weapons, could not travel freely, and could not learn about their old history. The Kethvar had destroyed most records of human culture to keep them weak. Down on New Eden, in a small farming town, 8-year-old Sarah Chen was drawing pictures in her bedroom. Her small hands moved a crayon across paper, making the colors of a flag she had seen in her grandmother's secret files: red, white, and blue stripes with white stars on a blue square. "Sarah, dinner time!" her mother called from the kitchen. Sarah quickly hid the drawing under her bed and ran to the kitchen. Her mother, Dr. Elena Chen, was setting food on the table. Elena had once been a soldier, but that was before Sarah was born. Now she worked as a medical worker in the colony, fixing small injuries and treating sick farmers. Sarah's father, Marcus Chen, came in from outside. His clothes were dirty from working on farming machines all day. Marcus was an engineer who built and fixed equipment for the colony. Like Elena, he had once done more important work, but the Dominion did not allow humans to do anything dangerous. "How was school today?" Elena asked Sarah as they ate. "We learned about the Great Peace again," Sarah said. "How the Kethvar stopped all the wars and made everyone safe." Marcus and Elena looked at each other. They both knew this was not the real story, but they could not tell Sarah the truth. The Dominion watched everything, and teaching real history to children was forbidden. After dinner, Sarah went to her grandmother's old room. Her grandmother had died 2 years ago, but she had left behind a small data device hidden under a loose floorboard. Sarah had found it by accident and learned to use it without telling her parents. The device showed pictures and videos of old Earth. Sarah saw huge cities with tall buildings, oceans full of ships, and people who looked happy and free. She learned about countries with different names and flags. She found songs and stories that made her feel excited and sad at the same time. Tonight, she found a song called Amazing Grace. She did not understand all the words, but the music made her feel warm inside. She sang it quietly to herself, trying to remember the tune. Far above the planet, Commander Zethkar was reading reports from other worlds. The Dominion controlled over 1,000 planets and hundreds of different alien races. Some races had fought back when the Kethvar first came, but they had all been defeated or destroyed. The key was to break their spirit before they could organize. The Kethvar were experts at this. They would study each race, find their weaknesses, and use fear to control them. Some races feared death, others feared pain, and others feared being alone. Once the Kethvar knew what scared them most, they could control them forever. Humans had been easy to understand. They loved their families and wanted to protect their children. So the HFY made rules that would punish children if parents disobeyed. This kept most humans in line without needing much force. "Commander," his aide said, interrupting his thoughts, "tomorrow is the monthly compliance inspection of New Eden. Should we send the usual team?" "Yes," Zethkar replied. "Send Enforcer Unit 7. Captain Multhak leads them well." The next morning, Sarah woke up excited. Her teacher had said they could share something special with the class today. Sarah decided she would teach the other children the song she had learned. She practiced singing it quietly while getting dressed. At school, Sarah waited for her turn. When the teacher called her name, she stood up and began to sing "Amazing Grace." Her clear young voice filled the classroom. The other children listened with wide eyes. They had never heard anything like it before. The teacher's face went white with fear. "Sarah, stop! Where did you learn that?" "From my grandmother's files," Sarah said proudly. "It's called Amazing Grace. Would you like me to teach everyone?" Before the teacher could answer, the classroom door burst open. 3 HFY enforcers marched in, their heavy feet shaking the floor. Their black armor made them look like monsters to the children. Captain Multhak stepped forward. His voice was cold and metallic. "We detected forbidden cultural transmission from this location. Which human child is responsible?" The teacher pointed at Sarah with a shaking hand. "She was singing something from old Earth files." Multhak's eyes focused on Sarah. She tried to look brave, but her hands were shaking. "Child, you have violated Dominion cultural purity laws. Where did you obtain these forbidden materials?" Sarah thought about her grandmother's hiding place. She remembered her parents' worried faces when they talked about keeping safe. She lifted her chin and said, "I won't tell you." The other children gasped. No one ever said no to the HFY. Multhak moved closer. "You will surrender all forbidden materials immediately or face punishment." Sarah shook her head. "These are mine. My grandmother left them for me." What happened next would change everything. But at that moment, Sarah Chen was just a brave little girl, protecting something she loved. She had no idea that her courage was about to shake an empire that had ruled through fear for 3 centuries. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when you hurt a human child. Captain Multhak stared down at the small human child who dared to refuse him. In 3 centuries of Dominion rule, most beings learned to obey quickly. This tiny creature with her defiant eyes was unusual. "You do not understand the consequences of disobedience," Multhak said, his voice like grinding metal. "I will ask one final time. Where are the forbidden materials?" Sarah's teacher tried to step forward. "Please, she's just a child. She doesn't understand." "Silence," Multhak snapped. The teacher fell back, terrified. Sarah looked around the classroom. All the other children were crying or hiding under their desks. She thought about her grandmother's gentle voice reading her stories from the hidden files. She thought about the flag she had drawn and the song that made her feel happy. "No," Sarah said quietly. "I won't give them to you." Multhak's mandibles clicked together in anger. He pulled out a shock device from his belt. It was designed to cause pain without lasting damage, perfect for teaching lessons to disobedient aliens. "This device will help you remember your place," he said, adjusting the settings. "Perhaps the pain will clear your mind." The shock blast hit Sarah in the chest. But something went wrong. The device had been calibrated for larger alien species, not for a small human child. Sarah's body was too small, her heart too fragile. She screamed once, then collapsed to the floor. Elena Chen was working at the medical center when her communication device buzzed with an emergency signal from the school. She dropped everything and ran through the streets, her heart pounding with fear. She burst into the classroom to find Sarah lying motionless on the floor. Elena's medical training kicked in immediately. She knelt beside her daughter, checking for vital signs. Sarah's eyes were open but empty. "What happened?" Elena demanded, cradling Sarah's small body. "Compliance punishment for cultural violation," Multhak said without emotion. "The child refused to surrender forbidden materials." Elena felt for a pulse, tried to restart Sarah's breathing, performed every emergency procedure she knew. But it was too late. The shock had stopped Sarah's heart, and too much time had passed. "She's dead," Elena whispered, then screamed it. "She's dead!" Marcus arrived at the school to find his wife holding their daughter's lifeless body. He had never seen Elena cry before, not even when her father died. Now she was making sounds he had never heard a human make. Deep wails of pain that came from somewhere beyond words. "This is an unfortunate accident," Multhak said, making notes on his datapad. "Compliance equipment malfunction. It happens sometimes with weaker species." Marcus looked up at the enforcer. "You killed our daughter." "I performed standard disciplinary action," Multhak replied. "The child's weakness is not my concern. Perhaps this will serve as a lesson to others about the importance of following Dominion law." Elena gently closed Sarah's eyes and stood up slowly. Her face had gone completely cold. "Get out," she said quietly. "Excuse me?" Multhak said. "Get out!" Elena screamed, lunging toward the enforcer. Marcus caught her before she could reach Multhak, holding her back as she fought against him. Multhak watched this display with mild interest. "Emotional instability is common in inferior species when faced with loss. This will pass. Continue normal operations." The enforcers left the classroom, stepping over Sarah's body as if she was just an obstacle in their path. That night, Elena sat in Sarah's bedroom, holding the drawing of the Earth flag her daughter had hidden under the bed. Marcus found the data device in their grandmother's old room and brought it to Elena. "She died for this," Elena said, looking at the pictures of old Earth. "For a song and some pictures." Marcus sat beside his wife. "The burial will be tomorrow. I've already made arrangements." Elena nodded, but she wasn't really listening. She was thinking about her old life, before Sarah was born. She had been Lieutenant Elena Vasquez then, a combat medic with the Earth Defense Force. She had seen friends die in battle and had always accepted it as part of war. But this was different. This was murder. "I need to make some calls," Elena said quietly. "Elena, what are you thinking?" She looked at him with eyes that had changed completely. "I'm thinking about what we used to be before we became farmers and medical workers." Marcus understood. He had been Commander Marcus Chen once, an engineer who designed weapon systems for military ships. They had given up their old lives when Sarah was born, wanting to raise their daughter in peace. But peace was an illusion when you lived under the boots of tyrants. Elena activated an old communication channel she hadn't used in years. Across human space, other old soldiers were receiving similar calls. The message was simple. They had killed a child. A human child who died singing a song about grace. On the Kethvar command ship, Zethkar was reviewing the day's reports. One line mentioned a minor compliance incident on New Eden. One casualty, no follow-up required. He barely glanced at it. Casualties during compliance actions were normal. The Dominion ruled over trillions of beings, and sometimes examples had to be made. One dead human child meant nothing in the larger picture of maintaining order. But across human space, something was changing. In mining colonies and farming worlds, in the hidden places where humans kept their real thoughts, the news was spreading. They had a name now, Sarah Chen, a little girl who died for refusing to give up her grandmother's memories. Old soldiers remembered their training. Engineers looked at their equipment with new eyes. Farmers who had hidden their past began to remember what they used to be. Dr. Elena Chen uploaded her daughter's drawing of the Earth flag to the underground human networks. She attached a simple message. "This is what she died for. This is what they're afraid of." The image spread like wildfire through secret channels the Kethvar had never detected. Humans who had forgotten their history saw the flag and remembered. Parents who had hidden their past from their children began to tell them stories about freedom. In the hidden research stations, weapons began to be built. In the mining colonies, explosives were diverted from their intended uses. On farming worlds, agricultural ships were secretly modified with armor and weapons. The Kethvar surveillance systems noticed increased chatter in human communications, but their analysis programs concluded it was normal grief response to the child's death. The psychological profiles said it would fade within a week. They were wrong. Sarah Chen's death had broken something fundamental in the human spirit. For 50 years, they had accepted slavery for the sake of their children's safety. Now they understood that their children would never be safe under Kethvar rule. The revolution had begun with a little girl's refusal to surrender her grandmother's memories. It would continue with her mother's promise that no other parent would have to bury their child for the crime of remembering where they came from. Sarah's funeral drew more people than any gathering on New Eden in 20 years. Humans came from distant farms and mines, many traveling for days to attend. The Kethvar allowed it because grief ceremonies were considered harmless ways for inferior species to process loss. They had no idea they were watching the birth of a revolution. Elena stood beside the small grave, wearing her old military jacket for the first time in 9 years. She had found it buried in the back of her closet, along with medals she had earned fighting pirates in the outer systems. The jacket still fit, but Elena herself had changed completely in the past week. As people paid their respects, Elena quietly made contact with faces she recognized. Former soldiers, engineers, ship captains who had accepted farming jobs to keep their families safe. One by one, she spoke to them in the old military code language that the Kethvar translation programs had never learned. "The package was damaged beyond repair," she would say. "Orders from command?" they would respond. "Make the delivery personal." Marcus moved through the crowd differently than his wife. Where Elena recruited soldiers, Marcus talked to the engineers and technicians, men and women who built farming equipment but remembered how to build other things, people who maintained communication arrays but could modify them for different purposes. "The mining laser on my farm needs adjustment," one would say. "I know a better focusing technique," Marcus would reply. By the end of the funeral, a network had been born. 3 days later, Elena received a response to one of her coded messages. It came from a frequency that was supposed to be dead, from a ship that was supposed to have been destroyed 15 years ago. "This is Admiral Helena Vasquez," the voice said. "I heard about the little girl. We're ready to come home." Elena's hands shook as she replied. Admiral Vasquez had been her commanding officer during the pirate wars. She was supposed to have died when the Kethvar destroyed her ship during the early occupation. Apparently, that had been a lie. "How many?" Elena asked. "More than you'd think. We've been busy." Over the following weeks, Elena learned the truth. When the Kethvar conquered Earth and forced humanity into submission, not everyone had surrendered. A core group of military personnel had faked their deaths and disappeared into the outer systems. For 50 years, they had been building secret bases, developing new weapons, and waiting for the right moment to strike back. They called themselves the Ghost Fleet, and they had been watching human space carefully. They had seen the farming colonies and mining operations, had identified the hidden soldiers and engineers living quiet lives. They had been preparing for decades, but they needed the right spark to begin. Sarah Chen's murder had provided that spark. Marcus discovered that their own communication network reached further than he had imagined. The maintenance workers who serviced Kethvar equipment were mostly human, chosen because they were considered harmless. For years, They had been quietly learning every detail of Dominion technology. "We know their ships better than they do," explained James Morrison, a man who had spent 30 years pretending to be a simple technician. "Every weakness, every backup system, every way to make their weapons turn against them." Elena found herself in contact with Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a scientist who was supposed to be researching better farming techniques. In reality, he had been developing weapons that looked like farming equipment, harvesters that could become mobile missile platforms, irrigation systems that could be turned into chemical weapon delivery networks. "The beautiful thing about farming equipment," Dr. Tanaka explained, "is that it moves freely between worlds. The Kethvar never inspect it carefully because they see it as harmless." Across human space, the awakening continued. On mining worlds, explosives meant for breaking rocks were secretly stockpiled. On transport ships, human crew members began making small modifications that would allow them to carry weapons instead of cargo. In communication centers, operators started building hidden networks that could coordinate actions across multiple star systems. The Kethvar surveillance systems detected increased activity in human communications, but their analysis programs concluded it was still grief response to the child's death. Their psychological profiles indicated that humans processed trauma through increased social bonding, which would naturally fade over time. Commander Zethkar reviewed these reports with satisfaction. "The humans are behaving exactly as predicted," he told his staff. "Emotional creatures seeking comfort from each other. This will pass." But Zethkar had made a critical error. He assumed that human emotion made them weak, when in fact, it made them unpredictable and dangerous. The Kethvar ruled through fear because they understood fear. They had never encountered an enemy motivated by love and grief. Elena began receiving reports from across human space that amazed her. On the agricultural world of New Vancouver, farmers had revealed that their grain storage facilities were actually disguised weapons factories. On the mining planet of Kepler's Rest, excavation equipment was being secretly modified into assault vehicles. Most surprisingly, the human workers who maintained Kethvar facilities had been conducting their own intelligence operations for decades. They knew the locations of every major Dominion base, the schedules of patrol fleets, and the weaknesses in orbital defense systems. "We've been mapping their entire military structure," explained Maria Santos, who had spent 20 years as a cleaner in the Kethvar command center. "They never noticed us because they thought we were too stupid to understand what we were seeing." Admiral Vasquez finally made contact with Elena directly, using a secure channel that piggybacked on agricultural shipping schedules. She appeared on screen as a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes and scars across her face. "I'm sorry about your daughter," Vasquez said simply, "but her sacrifice won't be meaningless. We're going to make them pay." "How many ships do you have?" Elena asked. "Enough. But this won't be won by ships alone. It will be won by people like you, in places like New Eden. When we strike, we need the Dominion to discover that their conquered humans aren't conquered at all." Elena understood. The Ghost Fleet could attack from space, but the real victory would come from within. When Kethvar forces turned to their human workers for support, they would find enemies instead of servants. Marcus had been working with engineering teams across a dozen worlds, coordinating the modification of industrial equipment into weapons. What the Kethvar saw as harmless farming tools would become the instruments of their defeat. "The wonderful thing about ruling through fear," Marcus said to Elena one night, "is that you assume your enemies are afraid too. They never imagined we might be angry instead." The final piece came when Elena received a message from an unexpected source. Teacher Lynn, Sarah's former instructor, had been in contact with educators across human space. They had been teaching Dominion-approved lessons for 50 years, but they had also been secretly preserving human history and culture. "The children are ready," Teacher Lynn said. "We've been preparing them without the Kethvar knowing. They think we're teaching obedience, but we've been teaching them who they really are. 3 months after Sarah's death, Elena stood in the same spot where her daughter was buried. But now she stood as Admiral Elena Chen, commanding officer of the New Eden Resistance Cell. Around her, farmers and miners had revealed themselves as soldiers and engineers. Hidden weapons caches had been distributed, communication networks were in place, the Ghost Fleet was moving into position, and across human space, millions of people who had pretended to be harmless workers for 50 years were ready to show their true faces. The Kethvar still had no idea what was coming. They continued to patrol their territories and enforce their rules, confident that their dominion was eternal. They were about to learn that there are some things more dangerous than fear. There is love and grief and the terrible fury of parents who will not let their children die in vain. The attack began at exactly 0800 Standard Galactic Time across 47 worlds simultaneously. The Kethvar called it the Day of Burning, though they would not understand what had happened until it was far too late. On New Eden, Elena stood in the main communications center that she had once cleaned as part of her cover. Now she wore combat armor she had hidden for 8 years, and her voice carried across the planet with absolute authority. All units, this is Admiral Chen. Operation Sarah's Song is now active. Remember, we fight not for conquest, but for justice. The first explosions came from the mining worlds. Charges that were supposed to break apart asteroids instead tore through the hulls of Kethvar patrol ships. Mining equipment that had moved rocks for decades suddenly revealed hidden weapons systems and opened fire on Dominion bases. Commander Zethkar was drinking his morning nutrition solution when the alarms began screaming across his command ship. His aide rushed to his side with a datapad full of emergency reports. "Commander, we're receiving distress calls from 17 sectors," the aide said, his voice shaking. "The humans appear to be attacking our facilities." Zethkar laughed. "Impossible. Humans have no weapons, no ships, no coordination. Send a patrol to deal with whatever small uprising this is." But the reports kept coming. On Kepler's Rest, the mining colony had somehow produced a fleet of armored vehicles that were tearing apart the Kethvar garrison. On New Vancouver, the grain storage facilities had opened to reveal missile batteries that were shooting down Dominion aircraft. "How is this possible?" Zethkar demanded. "Our intelligence said the humans had no military capability." The answer came when the first grain transport ship reached his command vessel. What should have been a harmless agricultural vessel suddenly revealed itself as a warship bristling with weapons. The fake cargo hold opened to launch fighters that should not have existed. On the bridge of that ship, Admiral Helena Vasquez smiled grimly. "This is the GSF resurrection to all Kethvar forces. You have exactly one chance to surrender before we show you what happens when you murder human children." Zethkar stared in shock. Admiral Vasquez was supposed to be dead. He had personally ordered her ship destroyed 15 years ago. "All available ships, engage the human vessels immediately," he commanded. But when his fleet tried to respond, they discovered their own human maintenance crews had sabotaged critical systems. Ships that should have powered up remained dark. Weapons that should have fired produced only sparks. On New Eden, Marcus had revealed the true purpose of his farming equipment. The massive harvester machines rolled across the landscape, but instead of gathering crops, they were launching missiles at Kethvar defensive positions. The irrigation systems that carried water to the farms now carried something much more deadly. Elena led the ground assault on the Dominion Administrative Center where Sarah had died. She moved with the skill of a veteran soldier, no longer pretending to be a simple medical worker. Behind her came farmers and miners who fought with the fury of parents who had been forced to hide their anger for too long. The Kethvar enforcers, who had terrorized humans for decades, suddenly faced opponents who knew their every tactic, every weakness, every fear. The humans had spent 50 years studying their captors, learning their technology, mapping their strategies. Captain Multhak, the enforcer who had killed Sarah, found himself cornered in the same classroom where the little girl had died. Elena entered the room with her weapon drawn, her face cold as space. "You remember this place?" she asked quietly. Multhak raised his shock weapon, the same type that had murdered Sarah. "You cannot defeat the Dominion. We have ruled for 3 centuries. "You ruled through fear," Elena replied, "but you never understood what you were really afraid of." The shock weapon discharged, but Elena was no longer where it had been aimed. Her combat training, hidden for years, had returned as if she had never stopped being a soldier. Her return shot was precise and final. Across human space, similar scenes played out on dozens of worlds. Kethvar forces that had maintained order through intimidation discovered they were facing opponents who had been preparing for this moment for decades. The communication networks that the Dominion had allowed humans to use for farming and mining coordination now carried military commands across star systems. The transport ships that moved between worlds revealed hidden weapons bays. The humans who had serviced Kethvar equipment for years activated hidden viruses that crippled Dominion computer systems. But the real shock came when the Ghost Fleet revealed its true size. What Zethkar had thought was a handful of surviving human ships turned out to be a full military force. Hidden bases throughout the outer systems launched vessels that bore no resemblance to the simple ships humans were supposed to possess. Dr. Yuki Tanaka's research stations revealed their true purpose when they began producing advanced weapons at an impossible rate. For 50 years, he had been developing not just new farming techniques, but new ways to wage war. "The beauty of being underestimated," Admiral Vasquez explained to Zethkar during their final communication, "is that your enemies never prepare for your true capabilities." The tide turned completely when other alien races saw what was happening. Species that had lived under Kethvar rule for centuries suddenly realized that the mighty Dominion was not invincible. If humans could fight back, maybe they could too. Rebellion spread beyond human space as other worlds saw their chance for freedom. The Kethvar found themselves fighting not just a human uprising, but a galaxy-wide revolution. Marcus's engineering teams had done their work perfectly. Dominion ships that tried to escape found their engines failing. Kethvar bases that tried to call for reinforcements discovered their communication arrays had been subtly sabotaged years ago. Elena's forces captured the Dominion Command Center on New Eden within hours. She stood in the same office where orders for Sarah's death had been processed, looking at files that contained the names of thousands of other murdered children. "This is Admiral Chen to all human forces," she broadcast. "Primary objective secure. Begin Phase 2 operations." Phase 2 was justice. The humans could have destroyed every Kethvar they found, but they chose a different path. Trials were established. Evidence was collected. The same careful attention to detail that had made the revolution possible was now applied to ensuring that the guilty were properly identified and punished. Commander Zethkar's final message was a surrender broadcast from his dying flagship. "To all Dominion forces," he said, his voice broken by defeat and disbelief. "Lay down your weapons. The humans have won." But Elena's response surprised him one final time. "This is Admiral Chen. We accept your surrender. Medical teams are being dispatched to treat your wounded. You will be given fair trials under interstellar law." Zethkar stared at the screen in confusion. "You show mercy to your conquerors?" "We show justice," Elena replied. "We're not fighting to become what you were. We're fighting to make sure no child ever again dies for the crime of remembering her heritage." The galaxy watched in amazement as humanity kept its word. This was not conquest through cruelty, but liberation through principle. The revolution had succeeded not just in destroying tyranny, but in proving that a better way was possible. 6 months after the revolution began, The galaxy had changed in ways that no one had expected. The mighty Kethvar dominion that had ruled for 3 centuries was gone, but what replaced it surprised everyone even more than the revolution itself. Elena Chen stood before the Galactic Justice Council in the same building where Kethvar administrators had once issued orders of execution and enslavement. But instead of a throne room designed to intimidate, the humans had created a simple courtroom where evidence was presented and laws were discussed. "The defendant will rise," Elena said, looking across the room at Captain Multhak. The enforcer who had killed Sarah stood between 2 human guards, but the guards were not there to intimidate him. They were there to protect him from angry crowds who wanted revenge. The humans insisted that even war criminals deserved fair trials. "Captain Multhak," Elena continued, "you are charged with the murder of Sarah Chen and 17 other children during compliance operations across human space. You are also charged with crimes against civilian populations under the Galactic Convention for the Protection of Non-Combatants. How do you answer?" Multhak's translator had been working perfectly throughout the trial, but he still seemed unable to understand what was happening. "You are conducting legal proceedings against your former masters?" "We are conducting justice," Elena replied, "something your Dominion never understood." The trial lasted 3 weeks. Evidence was presented carefully, with expert witnesses and detailed records. Multhak was allowed to have defenders speak for him, even though no Kethvar would do so. Human lawyers explained his rights and made sure he understood every charge against him. Other species watched these proceedings with amazement. For centuries, they had seen victory mean slaughter, conquest mean slavery, and revolution mean revenge. But the humans were doing something unprecedented. They were keeping their word about justice. The verdict was obvious, but the punishment surprised everyone. Instead of execution, Multhak was sentenced to life in a rehabilitation facility where he would be forced to study the cultures and histories of the species he had helped oppress. "You will learn the names and stories of every child you killed," Elena told him. "You will understand what they meant to their families, and you will spend the rest of your life working to prevent others from making your mistakes." Admiral Vasquez had established the new government structure with the same careful planning that had won the war. Instead of an empire, she created the Terran Federation, a defensive alliance designed to protect freedom rather than expand power. "We're not here to rule other species," she explained to the First Galactic Assembly. "We're here to make sure no one rules others through fear." The Federation's constitution was simple but revolutionary. No species could be forced to join. No world could be conquered for resources. No children could be punished for their parents' actions. Every being had the right to learn about their own history and culture. Marcus Chen had been elected as the Federation's chief engineer, but his job was not to build weapons. Instead, he led teams that traveled to former Dominion worlds, helping them rebuild the infrastructure that had been designed only to serve Kethvar needs. "The Dominion built everything to extract wealth and maintain control," Marcus explained to a gathering of alien engineers. "We're going to rebuild it to support the people who actually live there." The most surprising change came from the other alien species. For centuries, they had accepted that the strong would always dominate the weak. But humanity had proven that principle and organization could defeat raw power. The Veltar, a species of peaceful traders who had been enslaved for 200 years, were the first to approach the Federation for protection. "We have resources you need," their ambassador said. "But instead of taking them, you offer to trade fairly. We do not understand this, but we wish to learn." Elena found herself serving as both admiral and diplomat, helping former slave species adjust to freedom, while ensuring that former Dominion loyalists did not try to restart their empire elsewhere. The hardest part was dealing with the young Kethvar who had grown up believing that ruling others was their natural right. Elena established schools where they could learn about cooperation instead of domination, about service instead of exploitation. Your people are not evil, she told a group of young HFY students. But your system was. We're going to help you build something better. The memorial garden on New Eden had grown beyond anything Elena could have imagined. Sarah's grave was surrounded by thousands of flowers from dozens of different worlds, brought by beings who had heard her story and understood what her courage had meant. The inscription on Sarah's tombstone had been expanded. Below the original words, "She dreamed of stars," a new line had been added in dozens of alien languages. Her dreams became our freedom. But the memorial was not just about Sarah. Names of children from every species who had died under Dominion rule were carved into a great wall that stretched for kilometers. The HFY had tried to erase these histories, but the survivors remembered, and now their children would never be forgotten. Elena often came to the memorial when she needed to remember why they had fought. On quiet evenings, she would sit beside Sarah's grave and read the letters that arrived from across the galaxy. Children on distant worlds were learning to sing Amazing Grace in their own languages. Parents were teaching their young ones about the little girl who had refused to give up her grandmother's memories. "Did we do the right thing?" Marcus asked one evening as they stood together in the garden. Elena thought about the question seriously. The revolution had cost thousands of lives. Entire fleets had been destroyed. Worlds had been damaged in the fighting, but children across the galaxy were now free to learn about their own histories, to sing their own songs, to dream their own dreams. "I think she would be proud," Elena said finally, looking at Sarah's grave. "We didn't fight for revenge. We fought for the right of all children to grow up free." The Galactic Assembly met monthly now, with representatives from over 400 worlds. They argued and debated and sometimes disagreed strongly about policy, but they did it as equals, not as masters and slaves. Admiral Vasquez had stepped down after establishing the Federation, choosing to return to exploration instead of politics. "I'm a soldier, not a ruler," she explained. "The whole point of what we did was to make sure no one has to be ruled." The galaxy was learning to govern itself through cooperation instead of fear. It was messy and complicated and sometimes frustrating, but it was also something that had never existed before, a civilization based on consent rather than conquest. Elena's final act as military commander was to establish the Sarah Chen Academy, a school where beings from every species could learn about leadership, justice, and the protection of the innocent. The curriculum included the story of a little girl who had died rather than surrender her memories of freedom. "Remember," Elena told the first graduating class, "the strongest force in the universe is not fear or hatred or the desire for power. It is the love that drives parents to protect their children and children to honor their ancestors. Never let anyone convince you that love makes you weak. Love is what made us strong enough to change a galaxy." The age of tyranny was over. The age of freedom had begun. And it all started with an 8-year-old girl who refused to be afraid.